Hello everyone. In the last video we had a look at women during the times of the French Revolution. We saw how although the people in France were going against the ruling classes, they were demanding political rights. In the beginning it was only the men who had wealth who got voting rights. Later it became all men, irrespective of wealth, who had voting rights, but it still took an extremely long time for women to get their political rights or their voting rights in France. It happened as late as 1946. However, we saw one very brave woman, and there were many others like her who supported her, and they formed political groups. This woman was called Olympe de Gouges, and we saw how she wrote the Declaration of Rights of Woman and Man. Well, that was one social group for us, a social category which was excluded during the revolution, but they made sure that they were a part of it and they raised their voices and they demanded rights for themselves. When I say excluded during the revolution, I mean excluded by the dominant forces of the revolution. However, we also saw that women were wage earners at that time as well, although they may have not been earning very well, but they did go out and earn bread for their families, which is a very important factor, and we need to remember that. Anyway, so as we now move ahead, today we're going to have a look at another social category, which is the slaves. Slavery. Well, a basic idea of slavery would be when you're forcefully keeping someone against their will and making them work for you. They have no freedom, and so on and so forth, and no freedom, so of course no rights. To have a look quickly for what was happening to slaves in France, well, the Jacobean regime was the most revolutionary regime, because remember the Jacobeans were so the revolution always was done by the Third Estate, but in the beginning when the National Assembly was formed, that was the richer, educated part of the Third Estate. The Jacobeans who came after them were also the Third Estate, but they were more of the daily wage earners. So when the Jacobeans came to power, they abolished slavery in the French colonies. Let's have a look at how slavery was happening. Well, in the 17th century, the slave trade had begun, and slaves were brought from local chieftains. They were branded and shackled and packed into ships. Were branded and shackled would mean that slaves, like commodities, were sold in the market. They were branded, which means a stamp, mostly of hot iron, was put on them to identify them as slaves, and then they were shackled, which means they were chained up or tied, and then they were put in ships and they were shipped off. And when they were packed in ships, it was a bad scenario. They were living in unhygienic conditions for months at a stretch, because at those times, you need to remember, there were no airplanes. People were only traveling by ships, and journeys took a very, very long time. So a lot of people were huddled together, there were diseases breaking out, and they were kept in such inhumane conditions that some of them even died before they reached the destination. Anyway, those who did reach the destination, nothing very pleasant was waiting for them. Slaves were basically taken from across to the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Slave labor met the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. What you need to see is that in the Caribbean, the European countries like Britain, France, had a lot of plantations. Plantations are where you're growing cash crops and you can earn a lot of money. Now, who's going to work on these plantations? So they used to get slaves from Africa and transport them all across the Atlantic, all the way to the Caribbean to work for them. In 1794, the convention legislated to free all the slaves in the French overseas possession. However, we've already had a look in short that by the time this French Revolution ends, the time period that we're looking at, Napoleon comes back to power, and Napoleon, well, interestingly, goes on to declare himself emperor. And And the irony is, well, the revolution started by people not wanting monarchy, but in the end, the military dictator who did come to power, ended up getting monarchy back. So anyway, the convention said that all the freer slaves must be freed, but when Napoleon came back to power, he reintroduced slavery, which means he said, no, there's nothing illegal about slavery, and slavery should happen, because how else are we going to earn money? Who else is going to work in these fields? And well, it took some more time before slavery actually got finally abolished, and that happened in 1848. So that's just it about slavery. We don't have a lot in your syllabus in detail, so I won't go here and there either. Anyway, our next thing we're going to have a look at is how did the revolution affect the everyday life? Well, this is kind of interesting because we've already seen that the revolution was done by people of the third estate, both educated and rich, as well as people who were illiterate or not doing so well for themselves financially. Who were they inspired by? How did this word of revolution spread? How did so see, for example, today I have an idea, oh, let's do a revolution, and the society is not being functioning properly, people are not being treated well. How is this idea going to spread? How am I going to go tell everyone? Fine, today I may come to school, or I mean you guys are listening to me in the video, some of you may listen to me. But what about the rest of the people? How am I going to get my idea across? Well, I'm going to get my idea across through, of course, today I would use advertisements. There's TV, there's the radio. The internet is the best way to get ideas across. Remember, that is why whenever you're using WhatsApp or any of the social media platforms, you need to really be careful about fake news, because fake news spread rumors. At the same time, you also need to see how you don't realize, but you can actually be brainwashed for a certain idea, towards a certain idea. So, well, basically, mass communication, how is that going to be done? How am I going to get my idea across from people and from one place to another? Well, in those times, books, people had started reading a lot of books, so books were important, and also the theatre, plays, they were also important, because, well, a troupe, if they performed something, they went from one place to another performing that same thing. So that is how a lot of people came to watch, and they got inspired. Apart from that, songs. Even today, well, one song, and also many of us know it, if you just start humming it, a lot of songs, well, the lyrics don't make sense to us, but a lot of revolutionary songs have a very deep meaning behind them. So this is how ideas were spreading. So it was only possible for ideas to spread in France because there was abolition of censorship. Now, censorship, what does censorship mean? Censorship means when you are not allowed to write in the papers or sing songs or perform plays which instigate people, especially against the government. This in a way also means that there's restriction on the freedom of press or restriction on your right to speech and expression. Well, France at this time sees an abolition of censorship. What does that mean? It means that people were not restricted from thinking new things and spreading their ideas. So abolition of censorship actually helped France. It helped them through, like I said, plays, songs, processions, to spread their word. At this time, books were written by Montesquieu and Rousseau, which then rapidly spread amongst the people. And of course, Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which spoke of freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right, became very popular. Now you would say, why has censorship been abolished? Why should censorship not be allowed? Be prevalent? Because won't the first and second estate be unhappy that people are thinking such revolutionary thoughts? So why are they allowing freedom of press? Well, the thing is, a lot of times ruling classes do not allow the free movement of speech and press, and at this time also forces tried to stop it. But if you're aware, there's something like the black market, and where if one thing gets out, if for example one book gets out and it's been prohibited by the government, but you can buy various copies via the black market, and it just spreads in a secret manner. So a similar thing also then happened in France. Well, to conclude this chapter, like I said, by the end of it, a military dictator overtook France. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and he then ironically went on to crown himself the Emperor of France in 1804. Napoleon is an extremely interesting leader to look at. However, again, there's not a lot in your syllabus about him, so I'll just tell you a few changes that he made in the society, and economically especially. He introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weights and measures provided by the decimal system. So basically the decimal system that you study in maths, that got introduced by Napoleon in France. And he also introduced a proper system of weights and measures. He also said that private property is an essential right. However, in the end, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of at Waterloo in 1815, and it's important to see how these revolutionary ideas started in France back in 1789, but they kept going on in their various phases, like we've already seen. How the National Assembly came, then the Jacobians came, after that the Directory came, or the Directorate, and then came Napoleon. Still, and Napoleon got defeated in 1815, however, still women never got voting rights. And of course, another story for the slaves altogether, who when slavery got abolished by Jacobians, but then was reintroduced by Napoleon, and then finally abolished 10 years later. So the French Revolution has shown us a lot of aspects of political events as well as society, and how just because, you need to remember, just because a revolution is happening, it does not mean, and changes are happening, it does not mean that everyone is actually benefiting from them. And we've already seen here how even if when change came about, a certain section of people who were still unhappy, who were still not given their rights, and they still had to continue fighting for them. Alright, so just a second. What we really need to remember is that the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity that we believe in so strongly, that the Indian democracy so strongly believes in, has been inspired by the French Revolution. And alright, so well, that gets us to an end of chapter 1 of history, which was the French Revolution. At this time, I want you to pay attention that we've already finished the second chapter of civics also, and now we finished history chapter 1. I have already forwarded the notes to you and the worksheet. So now, once you're done with the videos and going through all the material that I send, please try writing down the answers to the questions in a rough notebook. If not that, you can probably just type it out in documents. If you have any problem, well, feel free to get in touch with me. All of you can get my number from the group, so that shouldn't be a problem. And well, that's about it. All right then, thank you.